Hello everyone and welcome. Our JCT music team, Helen, Steve, Ethel and myself, Michelle, are here this evening to take you through our webinar entitled Creating and Exploring Junior Cycle Music. Creating and exploring in all its many guises, in other words, creating and exploring through participating in music making, through appraising and responding, and through the creation of a musical composition. As you can see from our graphic here, we believe it should be fun, engaging, and by all means, messy. In working with our software this evening, regardless of what device you are using, you should see a screen like the one shown here. You will be able to post your comments and/or questions as we journey through this webinar. To post a question and/or a comment, please take a moment to follow the red arrow relevant to your device. We will pause at certain points throughout this talk to deal with any questions you may have. Peppered throughout this webinar, we will be showing some videos of classroom practice that our teachers have shared. Please don't be alarmed when you see a white screen as we move between the PowerPoint and the video. If you experience any interruptions in sound or visual, please be sure to check your Wi-Fi connection and know that if you accidentally log out of the webinar, that you will be able to rejoin by clicking on the original link in your email. Following this evening, this webinar will be posted on the elective workshops section of our website. As with all our work in the JCT music team, it is informed by what we call our trilogy. These are the documents that guide and inform all of the work of the JCT team, and they are the Framework for Junior Cycle, our Music Specification, and our Assessment Guidelines. As with all good learning, let us begin by sharing our learning intentions. Learning together this evening, we will create and explore how we can further nurture creativity in our young musicians. We will create and explore approaches in how we might further progress the learning from one concept to the next through many units of learning. We will create and explore the value of listening, composing, performing, and responding as an integrated learning approach throughout all our quality learning experiences. To finish, we will share further supports for you in creating and exploring with your music students. Along our journey, we have been asked many questions about how to enable our young students' creativity, how to be creative, and how to learn creatively. So some approaches we might consider in nurturing creativity in our students could be valuing the small steps, then scaffolding this learning to move the learning forward. Further valuing the students' efforts by acknowledging and praising their work. Building confidence for them so they become more curious about their learning. Find the strengths, abilities and talents of all your students to drive their learning more. Always focus on the learning and embed the knowledge. In developing your students' key skills, you are not only developing their successful learning, but also developing them for their life beyond school. We should always aim to instill a creative disposition in all our students, where they are free to take risks and have every opportunity to explore and realize their true potential. So, by nurturing creativity in this way, not only are we exemplifying our key skills, but we can be confident that we are also aligning the learning to the principles which underpin junior cycle reform. So, creativity is intelligence having fun. John Paitner once told us that to tap into a student's imagination is a direct link to their intellect, although it can sometimes be challenging for many different reasons. What does our specification tell us creating and exploring is? To create is to bring something into existence, to cause something to happen, and to explore is to scrutinize or systematically look into something closely. The specification further tells us what we can create and explore. For example, pulse, texture, style, tonality, etc. We might also use all of these musical ingredients to further scaffold creating and exploring in many different learning experiences. The specification provides many different opportunities for creating and exploring to take place through the underlying harmony, how sounds are layered, how melody might be constructed, and the feel and the moods associated with music. The framework for Junior Cycle aims to build on the good practice that is taking place throughout our classrooms. So here is a video from our music colleague as she shares her classroom practice with us this evening.
Creating and exploring in our learning space happens through responding to stimuli, using our instruments, our voices, and found sounds. Being detectives of sound.
We are detectives of sound. 5, 6, 7, 8.
Allowing ourselves to explore and experiment, realizing that there is no supposed to when being creative. There is no right or wrong, there is no one answer, there are no mistakes, just learning moments. Through asking questions, inquiring, being curious, making connections, observing others, generating ideas, and finding out more. Our unit of learning culminated in a group composing project called Morning Music. We engaged with Learning Outcomes 1.2, 1.11, 2.7, 2.9, and 2.10. We did this by listening to morning music by Grieg, Britten, and Haydn. We appraised and responded to these pieces. Then we used a short poem as our stimulus in order to create original group compositions. Our knowledge of the elements of music was a tool which guided and focused our discussion, our experimentation, and our decision making. We notated our work in graphic format, we performed our pieces and recorded them to video. Finally, we did a self-evaluation and a peer evaluation of each piece. Here is an extract from one of the compositions. This is Sunlight Racing Across the Surface of the Water.
Creating and exploring happens through responding to a stimuli, using instruments and voices and found sounds. Students being detectives of sounds. No supposed to when being creative. No right or wrong, no one answer. Before our webinar this evening, we invited you, our music colleagues, to get involved by completing an online survey. Thank you for your engagement with this survey. Here is the voice of 40 randomly selected teachers' answers from that survey. We asked you, what musical ideas do you employ when engaging your students in creating a musical composition? As you can see here, you told us that over 50% of your students are creating a musical composition by responding to a visual stimulus, while there is a relatively even spread across the other ideas, with some of our students creating and exploring electroacoustic music, creating anthems, and setting poems to music. In creating a musical composition, we then asked you to identify the learning outcomes that you felt were most relevant to this learning. The result was quite mixed, as you can see from here. The learning outcomes around symbolic representations of sound, rhythm, melody, chords, and jingles are very widely used. Also evident here is the rich engagement with responding to a stimulus. Our specification tells us that a stimulus is something that inspires students to create a musical idea and can come from a personal experience, an existing piece of music, a visual or graphic, a work of art, object, or a word. Let us now hear from a colleague who engaged in responding to a stimulus in his classroom.
This is where all of the creating and exploring happens. We began the year exploring music through the ukulele, learning chords and strumming patterns from various pop songs. Later on then we use those chords and strumming patterns to help us create things like jingles. So here's a poem about beans, which the kids later set to music, and they had a lot of fun with this. Early on in the year we also had a look at rhythms and basic clapping, and after we did a little bit of that, we explored some body percussion and some vocal percussion. And after it was explored, we created our own. So here is a student's body percussion, and here is another. This is a vocal percussion by a different student. And again, the kids really enjoyed doing this. The graphic scores I thought would be as enjoyable, but it was loved by some and absolutely hated by others, as I found out through some reflections that the students did afterwards. I do have a recording of the students responding to a stimulus, and I'm going to play it for you right now.
Exploring through the ukulele, chords, strumming patterns, pop songs, then using the chords to create jingles, graphic scores, and vocal sounds, all exemplifying good classroom practice. Now it is your turn. In considering all of our discussions to now, let us collaboratively share our own practice. Follow the red arrow, click on the Questions tab, and share one idea around creating and exploring that you have engaged with in your classroom. Maybe share what stimulus, if any, you used, or what approaches or methodologies worked for your students when creating and exploring. We will give you a couple of moments to complete this. We can see some great responses coming in there, so thank you for those. Some of you are still typing, so we're going to give you just a little bit more time. So many thanks for those. We will report back on your responses a little later on. Having looked at how we might nurture creativity, I will now pass over to Steve, who will look at how we might progress learning throughout our junior cycle journey.
Many thanks, Michelle, and hello to everybody. For this next section, we will look at how we could progress the learning through creating and exploring many different aspects of music. We will begin with creating and exploring symbolic representations of sounds with a focus on rhythm. Many times in our cluster days, we are asked to explain symbolic representations of sounds. To answer, we say these could include stick, staff, solfa notation, graphic scores, Roman numerals, chord names, to name just a few. Our specification tells us that by using all of these symbols to represent sound, we are furthering the development of procedural knowledge for our young students. There are two learning outcomes that specifically reference this learning. The first, from the procedural knowledge strand, talks about reading, interpreting, and playing symbolic representations of sound, while our innovate and ideate strand references devising symbolic representations of sound. Although explicitly referenced in these learning outcomes, we know that using symbols to represent sound will support all learning throughout our 3 years of studying music. So what is the learning that frequently happens in our first year music class? Many of you have told us that you begin with an icebreaker game focused on rhythm called My Name Is. This could be approached in many different ways. You could play a piece of music and ask the students to feel the beat by marching and clapping as they listen. Once they have a sense of the beat, students could then sound out their name as they march. For example, my name is Grania. In progressing this learning, students could then be asked to add the beat number beneath the words. The learning in this experience is students demonstrating an understanding of a pulse through the use of movement. In progressing this learning further, students might then create symbols to represent this sounding of their name. For example, by placing an X over each sounding of the word. The learning experience will scaffold students' learning as they begin to interpret sound by creating and reading symbolic representations of these sounds. In linking the learning across the strands, this learning outcome speaks to students experimenting by making different types of sounds on a sound source. One way this is achievable is through students creating and exploring their name using free software called Chrome Music Lab. Take a moment to hear this software in action. As you heard in that video, the students can explore the different instrumental timbres. If you are a classroom that doesn't have access to technology, this learning can just as easily be realized through the students exploring their name on different instruments, for example, a drum kit. So, by students feeling the beat and placing their X accordingly, the learning can build towards a standard rock beat. Having multi-modes of engagement for students acknowledges the many different ways that students learn. In further progressing, students devising playing, reading, and interpreting symbolic representations of sounds, they can start building the construct of rhythm notation by adding in stems, as you can see here. By the students creating and exploring their individual rhythms, they can compose an original piece of music for use in a new advertisement, which could be an advertisement for their class on a parents' evening, for example. Linking to our earlier digital learning and exploring of the drum kit, they can then create and explore what accompaniment they will use to support their performance. Collaboratively, learning together is an inherent part of junior cycle reform. This is further reinforced by the teacher voice of our webinar survey. As you can see here, only 3% of our teachers said students create and explore in a solo space, while 16% explore through group work. And a whopping 81% of you said that your students create and explore through both solo and group work, thus reinforcing the power of collaboration and the richness of learning that takes place when students learn together. To return to our earlier conversation on symbolic representations of sounds, we have looked at just one type of symbol. Students can also use graphic scores to represent sound. Let us hear from another colleague who has shared her practice around how she uses graphic scores.
So if you look at illustrate the structure of a piece of music through a physical or visual representation, that's procedural knowledge 1.11 in the appraising and responding section. My first years have made these posters. This one here is based on the can, and they would have used different pictures and ideas for each section, but some of the pictures would have slight changes in them, like the C section there. As you can see, the girls are in different coloured dresses, representing that it's C1 or C2, etc. And then we would have went back then to 1.5, read, interpret and play from symbolic representations of sounds, because they would then try and see through the main themes by looking at the posters. So that's one of them. There's some other ones here, and you can see the different types of symbols that people might have used. And then the third years, even though they're still on the old course, have done something similar for Dance of the Reed Flutes and for the Brandenburg Concerto.
There we have an example of graphic scores being used to visually represent the structure of a piece of music. The score then further used as a performing tool through interpreting the different symbols when singing through the main themes. In planning for learning, let us recap on all the learning outcomes we used in creating and exploring symbolic representations of sounds. All the learning is linked across the 3 interconnected strands. You can find our suggested planning templates to build your units of learning on our website. Now it is your turn. Taking on board all of the learning we have just discussed, what we invite you to do now is share with us through the questions tab how you might build on this learning in your classroom. Take a moment to brainstorm and submit your ideas. Thanks again for your engagement there. I will now pass to Michelle to report back on our early question. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Steve. So earlier we asked you to complete the sentence above. One of our colleagues has shared that creating and exploring in my music classroom takes place by using a balloon in their classroom as a visual stimulus. The students then created found sounds to represent the balloon. So thank you for sharing that idea. Another one of our colleagues has shared creating and exploring in my music classroom takes place through using the notes B, A and G on the recorder to compose short melodies. They've also been developing their rhythm through beatboxing, rap and body percussion. These ideas are being used for both rhythmic and melodic ostinatos. So thanks again for that idea. And you can see here, I suppose, how all of this learning can immediately link to learning outcome 1.1 through creating ostinatos. Let's hear from another colleague. This teacher tells us that playlists have been very popular for him. He has been used them with reference to his local area, in other words, the Fleadh in Drogheda. And we can also see from other teachers who have submitted their ideas this evening, they have spoken about using playlists for things like the ploughing championships, electric picnic, the St. Patrick's Day parade. A couple of teachers have referenced how their students designed CD covers or program notes to provide information on playlists. Thank you to everyone who contributed on the playlists, and you can see how this could be a strong scaffold in building the skills of creating a program note. Okay, let's hear from one more colleague. Other teachers have been adapting motifs from existing pieces of music from nursery rhymes, pop music, and classical pieces. One colleague tells us that Twinkle Twinkle was the piece of music she used to adapt an existing piece of music. They used glockenspiels, boom whackers, and bells for the melody, and ukuleles to decide on the chords that would suit. This teacher also has a student undertaking the Level 2 learning programme in her class. Because the glockenspiel, boomwhacker and bells all have the same colour assigned to the same notes, it meant this student was able to engage fully in all of the classroom experiences. So thank you to that teacher for sharing that with us. The principles of inclusion, well-being and engagement and participation are very clearly activated here. There are lots of other examples being shared with us here this evening, and many thanks to everyone for engaging. Please continue to share if you wish. We're going to take all of your ideas and post them as a resource on our website when uploading the webinar in the coming days. I will now pass you over to Helen.
Thanks, Michelle, and hello, everyone. So we have looked at creating and exploring symbolic representations of sound with the focus of rhythm. Now let's build on this learning by looking at creating and exploring improvisation with the focus on melody. Again, we find two learning outcomes. The first references improvising over a recording, while the second is improvising with making different types of sounds on a sound source. The specification tells us that to improvise is to create and perform music spontaneously without prior preparation. Let us build on our rhythm learning from earlier to start engaging the students with creating and exploring melody. In progressing this learning, students could now create and explore all of these words and/or images on one note, thus building the skill of improvisation. Having had the sound before symbol experience, students could now start to build the symbolic representations aligned with each of the words. For example, a simple 4-bar melody might look like this, and the students could perform it through singing and/or playing it on their instruments. Through group work, they can further create a short piece of music using this methodology. In progressing this learning, students can further build their procedural knowledge in using rests in their compositions. For example, take a look at track 1 here and notice how the students gain understanding around the concept of a quaver rest in track 2. The context of where these one-note patterns occur can be explored. Our example here is the use of fanfares. The learning in our culture and context strand speaks to devising and performing examples of incidental music that could be used in a variety of contexts or environments. For example, royal ceremonies or commemorating the dead, etc. This learning may also scaffold the exploration of brass and percussion instruments, as well as the musical features of repeated patterns. Another inherent feature of fanfares is the use of dotted rhythms. Here is another building of tracks to scaffold the understanding and use of dotted rhythms. Also note here that students are now being given the opportunity to learn about the root, the third and the fifth. In other words, building towards an understanding of triads. This learning is inherent in our learning outcome from the procedural knowledge strand, which has the chords at the heart of the learning. Similar to embedding digital learning earlier, we can use the chords tab in Chrome Music Lab for the student to explore what triad is most suitable to support this single melody line. The context of where and how composers use fanfares and triads can be explored further through contextual listening. Here is a great example of a composer who has combined the musical devices of fanfares and triads. Do you recognize it? Have a listen. This learning of fanfares and triads in our William Tell Overture can then be further progressed by the students engaging in a study of a particular historical style and analysing the use of musical devices, as is the learning at the heart of this learning outcome here. Let us check in on our learning. So we explored 4 learning outcomes in creating and exploring symbolic representations of sounds. Here are another 4 to build on that learning, encompassing knowledge, understanding, skills and values, with melody, triads, fanfares and the classical period. In planning for learning, if you consider the age and stage of learning for your students and plan using these 5 steps, you can be assured you are planning for effective learning. Now I will ask Michelle to report back on what suggestions you have shared in progressing your learning.
Hello again, everyone. Earlier, we asked how you might build on the learning of symbolic representations of sound in your classroom. We got lots of short, snappy responses, of which I will share a few with you. Some teachers are building on the learning of symbolic representation of sound and the use of words by using the rhythms to develop students' sight reading and dictation skills. Another teacher is creating through group work a rap based on a poem that they have written about their first year music class. One colleague in Carlow uses the words and rhythm to create vocal percussions. Another teacher reminded us of how GarageBand is a great resource for creating backing tracks or loops for when students are working with their rhythms. And here's a very interesting approach where students are using shapes, Lego and/or lollipop sticks to develop their understanding of beats, the construction of a bar, and the length of rhythms. It seems from the many responses that graphic scores is a very accessible way of representing sounds for your students. One colleague has used graphic scores to create an Ihe sauna soundscape using instruments, vocal sounds, and other sounds made from objects in the room. Lots of you are using graphic scores through the 4-cell idea, similar to Smalin on your technology and Kadinsky in Chrome Music Lab. So again, thank you so much to everyone for sharing your classroom practice with us this evening. As we all know from our quote that we used in our cluster day this year, the most valuable resource that teachers have is each other. So thank you again. We appreciate your engagement. And now I will ask Steve to take you through the next section.
Some really rich learning there, moving from rhythm into melody, building on triads. Now we will have a look a little closer at creating and exploring jingles in our junior cycle music. Our specification tells us a jingle is a short slogan, verse, or tune to be easily remembered, especially for advertising. This reference to advertising can be found in a number of our learning outcomes. In considering the creation of a musical statement, we might explore an advertising jingle as referenced in our Innovate and Ideate learning outcome. Whereas in our culture and context strand, the jingle is original and for use in a new advertisement. There are many different ways that we can create and explore jingles in music. Here is one suggestion. After listening to a variety of jingles, the learning experience could be the students creating their own jingle through using the notes from our note bank. Another great way to use a note bank is to ask the students to put the notes in the correct order in which they are heard in the jingle. Scaffolding contextual listening can be further achieved through giving the notes of the jingle and asking the students to fill in the missing rhythm. All of these learning experiences are inherent in this learning outcome, taking from our procedural knowledge strand, which exemplifies the skill of transcribing rhythm and melody. To progress this learning further, Students could be asked to indicate the chords suitable to support the melody line. Take a look at this simple jingle here. Do you recognize it? Your students will when they hear it. Engaging in the following video can scaffold appraising and responding in the classroom. As you listen to this video, consider the learning at the heart of this learning outcome and how you might progress the learning in your classroom. In considering the learning from this learning outcome, we can hear how each variation of the motif was achieved through added harmonies, changed instrumentation, and a different use of styles. So, as we have evidenced, creating and exploring can take place through many different means. The voice of our survey tells us that over 90% of our students are creating and exploring through instruments and/or singing, which builds on what is new for junior cycle music, in that students can use instruments to compose for their first classroom-based assessment, which is the composition portfolio. Let us now check in on our learning. So here is our learning outcomes in focus that informed all of our learning in creating and exploring jingles. As always, when planning for learning, this linking of learning outcomes will be your starting point in building a unit of learning in planning for effective learning. Helen will now take us through progressing this learning even further.
Thanks, Steve. Where might we go and how might we build on all this learning? Take a look at the learning at the heart of this learning outcome and consider how symbolic representations of sound, rhythms and dotted rhythms, repeated patterns and melody, fanfares and chords of 1 and 5 might help to create and explore arranging music. There are many approaches to building the skills of arranging. For example, having the melody as your starting point. Equally, you could use the accompaniment as your starting point. Here is an example of one we prepared earlier. So in this example, we explored an accompaniment as a starter point of our arrangement. If we start with track 2, entitled Begins, we can see the simplicity of creating a melody using 3 notes that many students begin with, B, A, and G. Track 3 then builds on our learning of repeated notes and stepwise melody, aptly entitled Walks. With our learning of chords of 1 and 5 and indicating chords to a single melody, students can now build on our baseline in track 6. This learning of triads is further progressed in creating track 5. The result of combining both of these tracks can be the compilation of a piano track. Building even further on this understanding of triads, the students can be challenged to use chords to create a line with melodic interest. As you can see in track 4, entitled Leaps, the understanding of the chord is apparent along with the evidence of the dotted rhythm learning. Notice engaging all students and differentiation is apparent in each of these tracks, begins, walks, and leaps. Finally, we need a melody to accompany our arrangement. From listening to their accompaniment and building on their learning to date of repeated patterns, dotted rhythms, composing using chords, the melody could be something like this. The extension learning could be students exploring opera then and now. For example, La Donne e Mobile is being used in an advertisement on television at the moment. You could get them to possibly create their own. So, in creating this musical composition, let us look at how students might present their compositions for their portfolio, how they might present their programme note for CBA2. The teacher voice of our survey tells us that the written format remains the most popular for both our classroom-based assessments, with audio being more popular for the composition portfolio and digital for the programme note. You, as the teacher, together with your student, are best positioned to decide on what mode of presentation will work best for your students. In line with Universal Design for Learning, this choice of multiple modes of presentation is to be aspired to. I will now hand you over to Ethel.
Thank you, Helen, and hello, everyone. Just to say a huge word of thanks to everybody who has already contributed to tonight's webinar. So to recap, our learning intentions for this evening began with exploring possible ideas on nurturing creativity in and with our junior cycle students. From valuing the small steps to building their confidence, finding the strengths, abilities, and talents of all of our students, to ultimately drive their learning forward and enable and fulfill their potential. We created and explored how we might progress the learning, starting with that simple icebreaker game that we know is so popular in so many of our classrooms, My Name Is. In progressing this learning, as you can see here, we used 11 of our 36 learning outcomes, and as you can see, they were chosen from across the 3 interconnected strands and through the 3 elements. This learning journey began with creating symbolic representations of sounds from our icebreaker game. We then moved into an introduction to melody, possibly through improvising. We then progressed this learning through the musical devices of fanfares, then constructing and working with chords or triads in this case, using those triads and devices to create a jingle, and then building on all of this learning to arrange a piece of music. Our third learning intention for this evening spoke about integrating the learning. And as we know, this deals with the students having a really deeper engagement with the learning through integrating appraising and responding, participating and music making, and creating and exploring throughout all of the learning experiences where and when possible. This integrated learning approach was evident as students will have engaged with composing, performing, listening, and responding throughout all of our learning experiences this evening. And our specification, which is our key document and which guides all of our thinking around junior cycle music, further acknowledges this integrated learning approach when it states that engagement and learning are optimized by a fully integrated experience. To move to our final learning intention for this evening, in exploring all our supports, and we hope in future further supports for you in implementing our new junior cycle music specification, take some time, visit our website, www.jct.ie. Here you will find the relevant key documents, our most recent updates in news and events, all our resources, PowerPoints, booklets, posters, everything is here for you at your fingertips, available to download. If you haven't already joined our mailing list, you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner of our slide there, you can join our mailing list by simply clicking on that tab and inputting your details. Alternatively, you can also follow us on Twitter, but we do strive to keep you as up to date on our news events tab, on our mailing list, and on Twitter. The webinar that you've seen here this evening, which is action-packed, and we do realise it's a huge amount of information in a very short space of time, don't be alarmed. It'll be posted and uploaded in the coming days to the elective workshops tab, as you can see here on the slide, the CPD workshop section. Another support that certainly we have found very interesting in the last couple of weeks, and that you may find useful yourselves in creating and exploring, is a podcast called Song Exploder. And you can find this podcast on songexploder.net. And this is a podcast where musicians share how their songs are constructed. You will notice in the slide here a picture of Hosier, but this app offers many opportunities for engagement across many different styles of music, for example, from the Bach cello suites all the way to Hosier sharing how his songs were created, for example. Another new resource that certainly we're very excited by is a new radio player app called Play Irish, which champions Irish music both nationally and internationally. And this app will see a whole range of Irish artists celebrated, from our established musical heroes all the way to up and coming new Irish artists. This app could provide a great scaffold for creating and exploring many different aspects of our learning outcomes. And for example, one such learning outcome from our culture and context strand, which speaks to students exploring the time allocated to Irish artists and performers on a variety of local or national Irish media, and then presenting those findings to their class. So now, before we finish this evening, in keeping the conversation going, it's back over to you. We invite you now to log on to menti.com and enter the code 654868. Just be careful that you don't exit the webinar. So if you wanted, you can do this now by minimizing your webinar screen and logging in directly. And alternatively, as you have seen from all our previous CPD and professional learning experiences, we have been using QR codes. So if you just scan the QR code seen here on the slide, it will bring you directly to our Mentimeter. The question we would like you to share with us is, how will you progress the learning in building towards the composition portfolio and/or program note? And this can be something you have already tried in your classroom, or something that you think, as a result of our conversations here this evening, will further support you in building towards our 2 classroom-based assessment moments. And I'll just pause ever so slightly for a couple of seconds, maybe minutes even, just to give you a moment to ponder on that. Thank you. There's some very nice answers coming in there now. Alternatively, and we do appreciate it's quite a loaded question, but equally an important one. So alternatively, in truly keeping the conversation going, why not have a think about it? Have a ponder, log on at a later stage. As we on the music team, we will keep this Menti open for the rest of this week to gather as many of your thoughts as possible. So please continue to share your thoughts and your classroom practice, because our aim is to gather together, bring all of your ideas together and post them as a resource on our website. To finish, that brings us to the end of this evening's engagement. Thank you all for your participation throughout our webinar this evening. A special warm thank you to all of our colleagues, to Grania, to Carmel and to Shane, who shared their classroom practice here this evening. On your behalf, I would like to say a special word of thanks to the JCT music team, to our full-time advisors and all of our wonderful part-time associates for all of their hard work throughout the year. What's next? Well, keep the conversation going. That is the most important thing. Remember, as we spoke about all the way through the many different clusters we engaged with you this year, the most valuable resource each one of us has is actually each other. Certainly on my behalf and on behalf of Michelle and Steve and Helen and all of our associates, we are very much looking forward to meeting and working with you again in future cluster days and in future elective workshops and wherever our journey takes us. But for now, Míle buchas, Ganyari and Taliv, agus I Hawaii.